The gavel fell once, sharp against the wood. A judge leaned forward, voice firm. Senator Kennedy's argument is not relevant. The chamber shifted. Reporters looked up from their notes. Kennedy didn't flinch. Instead, he reached beneath the desk, pulled out a case file, and laid it flat. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "then why does your own court's precedent say otherwise?" The silence that followed was heavier than the gavel. Like and subscribe if you're ready to see how one precedent ended the whole exchange. The courtroom wasn't grand, no marble pillars, no echo chamber. It was a federal hearing room built for clarity, not drama. A judge's bench, a long dock, a podium, and rows of seats that felt narrower than needed. But the walls carried weight. Centuries of rulings whispered through the cream-toned drapes. On this morning, everything was in its place. Staffers in navy suits checked their tablets. Aides arranged folders with precision. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, cameras zoomed. Calm, polite, routine. At the head, the judge, appointed years earlier, sat with an air of unassailable order. Rigid posture, robe immaculate, gavel polished. Hands clasped, eyes steady. This isn't a place for surprise. This is where the law speaks last. Senator John Kennedy entered last, not with flair, but with intent. No thunderous applause, no entourage, just a quiet step, a soft click of heels, and he settled into his seat opposite the bench. The difference between picker and piano, the hush of a room that expects him to perform, but hopes he doesn't. Kennedy glanced only once at his legal pad, then leaned back. No preparation jitters, no glancing side to side. His calm made the room itch for movement, because calm is the quiet before a storm. The chair called the room to order. Prosecutors nodded. The gavel tapped. The judge began the hearing in a voice that didn't ask for attention. It collected it. "We convene to hear argument regarding procedural jurisdiction in the limits of executive authority." Formal. Final. This was supposed to be regulation, not revelation. Schiff, sitting nearby, cleared his throat and prepared his papers. He looked confident, trained for this. But Kennedy never gave him a glance. He didn't need to. The judge's voice alone held enough gravity that the senator could lean back and listen. The judge, when addressing Kennedy, called him Senator Kennedy. And that senator carried weight. But Kennedy's response wasn't immediate alignment. It was stillness. "I thank the court for convening this hearing," Kennedy said when his turn came. Not loud, just calm, deliberate. "My concern will not be with executive authority broadly, but with a specific claim made in the last hour that this matter is procedurally irrelevant." A quiet murmur passed through the room. Though the judge's eyebrow barely raised, the gallery felt it. This wasn't polite critique. This was precision drilling through protocol. The judge held the silence, then replied with measured tone. "Senator, procedural relevance, it is a standard that ensures this chamber respects the separation of powers. The court's claim stands. Order restored, or so it seemed. The judge believed he'd redirected the flow back into drainage, legalese, bound and proper. But Kennedy didn't deflect. He didn't traverse away with decorum. He leaned forward, just slightly, just enough, and said, "With respect, Your Honor, procedural relevance matters most when binding precedent contradicts it. And that's what I'll address." The air shifted. Not dramatically, no exclamation points in the sound, but deeper, subtler. People in the back row leaned forward. Staffers cleared throats. A producer in the gallery tapped her laptop and switched to record. Because procedural relevance means nothing if the precedent says otherwise. And the judge, master of order, had just been served a rule he couldn't ignore. The judge expected a question framed like every other. Cautious, respectful, clipped in tone. Senators know the rhythm, defer first, then prod. But Kennedy didn't move like that. He waited until the paper stopped rustling, until Schiff's pen tapped once and stopped, until the silence thickened enough that even the microphones hummed. Then, with the measured pause of someone who already knew the ending, Kennedy asked, "Your Honor, is precedent binding on this chamber, or is it ornamental?" It wasn't an inquiry. It was a trap set with velvet lining. The courtroom shifted. Staffers froze mid-note. The judge blinked, just once, but the meaning was obvious. This was no ordinary procedural challenge. To call precedent ornamental in front of a federal bench wasn't curiosity, it was accusation. The judge's jaw tightened. Precedent is binding, Senator. This court respects the hierarchy of law. Kennedy didn't nod, he didn't smile. He let the silence sit just long enough for the judge's words to hang heavy, then tilted his head. Then help me understand, he said, voice low, why we're treating the 1997 ruling in Hastings versus Federal Council as a footnote when it states plainly that procedural objections cannot be used to bury substantive violations of statute. The name, Hastings versus Federal Council. It was like striking a tuning fork against the bench. Reporter's pen snapped upright. Schiff's lips pressed into a line so tight it could have cut paper. The judge leaned back, robes pulling tight across his shoulders. He hadn't expected Hastings. No one had. It wasn't a headline case. It was buried in the dusty volumes of case law, a decision cited maybe twice in 20 years. But Kennedy had reached into the basement of jurisprudence and pulled it into daylight. Senator, the judge began carefully, this chamber is not on trial. This chamber sets the frame for, Kennedy cut in, not with volume but with precision. Then let's be clear. Hastings says the chamber cannot discard evidence under the banner of procedure if the statute at issue compels review. So is Hastings precedent, or is it not? This wasn't a question. This was a knife slipped between ribs. The gallery murmured. The sound wasn't loud, but it swelled, the way air changes when people realize history is tilting. Schiff shuffled his notes. Too fast. A page crumpled. Camera zoomed. The judge's hand brushed the gavel, but didn't strike. Because if he struck now, it would sound like desperation. Finally, the judge said, precedent is acknowledged, but the application, Kennedy leaned forward, eyes steady. With respect, Your Honor, precedent isn't acknowledged. It's followed. Otherwise, the robe is costume. The word landed like thunder. Costume. A robe reduced to theater. The gallery inhaled as one. Schiff's head jerked toward the bench, waiting for backlash, waiting for Kennedy to be slapped down. But the judge didn't slam the gavel. He didn't shout. He exhaled, slow, careful, and shifted in his chair, which meant only one thing. Kennedy's point had teeth, and now the room knew it. A robe can dismiss a sentence of summons. It can't dismiss a citation. The judge tried to sand the edge off Hastings with a measured breath. Application varies by circumstance, he offered, each syllable laid like a plank over thin ice. The gallery murmured. Schiff stopped pretending to read. Even the stenographer's keys seemed to slow, as if they wanted the words crisp for replay. Kennedy didn't answer right away. He let the room sit with the idea that precedent could be acknowledged, the way a painting is admired in a museum, seen and then passed by. Then he reached, slowly, into the leather folder he'd refused to touch until now. No stack, no binder, one sheet, cream stock, black ink, a case style at the seam, and a date that did the talking for him. He laid it flat on the wood as though setting down a receipt. Your Honor, he said, voice low enough to pull microphones closer. Hastings isn't a proverb, it's an instruction. And it reads, he didn't look up as he spoke. He read, word for word, where the enforcement of a statutory right is chilled by a procedural bar, the court's duty is to prefer review over refusal. Procedure is a handmaiden to substance, not its master. The sentence landed and then kept landing, like thunder rolling between buildings. Heads lifted up from screens. One aide mouthed handmaiden as if tasting a word they hadn't heard since law school. The judge's fingers resting on the oak curled a fraction inward. Kennedy tapped the margin with a forefinger. Page 12, footnote 6, dated June 3, 1997, issued by your court. He looked up now. I didn't write it. I just learned it. The judge kept the face they'd earned over decades, composed, distant, above. But the robe doesn't teach the blood not to move. A vein in the temple spoke. The gavel stayed still, which told the room more than a strike would have. There was nothing procedural to swing at. Senator, but the judge began, Hastings concerned a different posture. There, the parties sought immediate relief against. Kennedy turned the page toward the bench so the header faced the camera lenses. It concerned a statutory right in an election context, Your Honor. Timelines, injunctive posture, and a court warned itself not to hide behind procedure when the statute was bleeding in real time. He slid the page back. Tell me again why we're allowed to pretend it's ornamental. Schiff shifted, testing the air for a new line of attack, then thought better of volunteering as tribute. The majority counsel 2 rows back scribbled, "Limit Hastings, distinguish facts," and underlined it twice. But distinguishing facts is harder when the language is this clean. The judge tried the higher ground. Senator, if we litigate doctrine by committee hearing, the independence of the judiciary is safer than if we ignore doctrine on television. Kennedy said, not unkindly. No one is telling you how to rule. I'm reminding you how you already did. A ripple of "oh" went through the press row, quiet, but there. The kind of sound that means a clip just found its caption. Kennedy lowered the page and softened the cadence, almost conversational. Back home, when a man says one thing in June and another in July, folks don't argue philosophy. They hold up the calendar. He tapped the date again. June 3rd, 1997. That calendar says you taught this rule to the rest of us. The judge went to the well they knew best, decorum. Senator, I must caution you against impugning. Kennedy shook his head. No impugning, just reading. He slid a second slip from beneath the first, not a full opinion, just a thin, photocopied note. Clerk's guidance issued alongside Hastings. Panels encountering statutory claims under exigent timelines are advised to err on the side of access to review. He looked up. Advised by whom? The judge didn't answer. They didn't have to. The clerk's masthead said the quiet part. Silence widened. Not empty, pressurized. A producer in the gallery whispered to no one, that's the pull quote. Another texted a lower third, precedent versus procedure. Kennedy let the pressure do its work. He didn't drive the nail. He simply stopped hammering so the room could hear that it was already in. If Hastings is wrong, say so, he offered. Palms open, voice almost gentle. If it's right, follow it. But don't tell me a handmaiden gets to run the house. A faint chuckle, one then none, died on the minority bench. The chair, who had raised the gavel 3 times today for far pettier offenses, set it down with a care that looked like respect or fear, depending on the angle. The judge took a longer breath. Senator, courts do not exist to provide political cover, they said, attempting to reclaim altitude. We issue opinions, not assurances. Kennedy smiled, a small thing that didn't travel to the eyes. Exactly, he said, and Hastings is an opinion, not an assurance. It assures nothing. It commands. He tapped the page once more, then folded his hands. So the only relevant question is whether we're still the kind of republic where yesterday's commands bind today's convenience. That wasn't a question anyone in the room wanted to answer on the record, which is why, for a long beat, no one tried. The judge's gaze drifted, just once, toward the robe folded on the chair back. It looked heavier now, or maybe the room had gotten brighter. Either way, the cloth that makes people stand when you walk in doesn't help much when a footnote with your name on it is walking the other direction. Kennedy nudged the page back into the folder without drama, as if to say we can put this away, or we can take it back out. The power in that gesture wasn't threat, it was option. It let the bench choose whether the next minutes would be about resistance or recognition. No one breathed loudly. Someone's pen rolled, caught by a cuff before it hit the floor. Schiff's chair creaked and stilled. Kennedy looked back to the judge and gave them the politest trap in the English language. Your Honor, would you like to clarify the scope of Hastings for the committee? The judge swallowed the tiniest swallow. Hastings, they said carefully, stands for the proposition you recited. Thank you, Kennedy replied, and the thanks sounded like a verdict. A courtroom can weather pages of law, but one handwritten line can still split it open. The tension in the chamber had settled into a kind of heavy truce. The judge had admitted, however reluctantly, that Hastings meant what Kennedy said it meant. That alone was rare. But Kennedy hadn't folded his folder for nothing. He opened it again, slower this time, As if peeling back a lid the whole room wasn't sure they wanted lifted. The gallery leaned forward. Schiff half rose, then thought better of it. The judge's jaw set. Kennedy withdrew not an opinion, not a statute, not even a clerk's memo, just a photocopied note. The edges curled, the ink uneven. A scan, clearly, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. The judge's own hand. He held it up so cameras could catch the masthead. The flashbulbs clicked like rain. "This," Kennedy said quietly, "isn't from a law book. It's from Chambers." The judge stiffened. Schiff shifted in his seat like he'd been burned by the recognition. A murmur rippled through the staff bench. Kennedy laid the page flat where everyone could see. Handwritten notation in the margin of Hastings. June 1997, and the line reads, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When in doubt, give the people their day in court. The rest is procedure. The room froze. The gallery, the press, even the aides who lived on adrenaline, no one moved. Because a published opinion is one thing. A public philosophy, signed and sealed, is another. But a note in the judge's own handwriting? That was raw. That was private. And Kennedy had just made it public. The judge's gavel twitched in their hand. They didn't strike. Striking would mean acknowledging the paper's existence. Ignoring it meant letting the words echo. Kennedy let the silence do its work. Then he looked up, meeting the judge's eye with the kind of steady calm that doesn't need volume. "You wrote that sentence 28 years ago. You believed it enough to ink it. And I'm asking you now, in front of the country, whether you still do." The judge's lips parted, then closed. The air felt carved in half. Schiff leaned in like he might object, but no one gave him the oxygen. The words on the page had already taken the floor. Kennedy didn't press. He didn't gloat. He simply folded the paper back into the folder, as if returning a mirror no one wanted to look into, but everyone had just seen. Sometimes, he said almost gently, the law doesn't need to be invented. It just needs to be remembered. The line landed like a bell, not loud, but ringing, steady, impossible to unhear. When a private sentence becomes public, power doesn't just shift, it scrambles. The judge had choices. They could strike the record. They could redirect the chamber. They could even lean into authority and silence Kennedy by sheer force of voice. But each option carried a cost, and everyone in that chamber knew it. Schiff moved first. He leaned forward with a lawyer's urgency, voice cutting through the dead air like a blade. "Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, Senator Kennedy is introducing material that is outside the record. Handwritten scraps are not judicial precedent." His tone was sharp, rehearsed, the pivot of someone trying to jam a crack shut before the whole wall collapsed. But it wasn't working, because the problem wasn't the material, it was the recognition. The audience, both inside and watching outside, already understood what they had seen. Schiff's objection sounded less like defense and more like retreat. Kennedy waited. He let Schiff run through his rehearsed objection, let the syllables trip over each other, let the pivot try and fail in real time. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice calm enough to make the camera zoom in on instinct. "Congressman," he said evenly, "I didn't bring the note here to make it precedent. I brought it to remind this chamber, and the judge, that precedent without principle is just paperwork, and paperwork doesn't carry a conscience." The room stilled again. Schiff's jaw tightened, but his eyes flicked toward the judge, searching for reinforcement that wasn't coming. The judge shifted in their seat, every motion of their robe magnified by the silence. "Senator, this hearing is not a trial of words written in the margins of history. It is about law, codified, formal, established." Their voice held steel, but it wasn't enough to drown out the fact that their own handwriting had just been read aloud to the nation. Kennedy didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let the pivot fall under its own weight. The gallery murmured. Reporters' pens scratched faster, not slower. Schiff slumped back an inch, sensing the floor wasn't holding. For the first time, the judge's gavel struck. The sharp crack rang through the chamber like an order to stop breathing. But it wasn't control. It was desperation. Because no gavel could erase what had already echoed. Kennedy closed the folder at last, the sound loud in the hush. His eyes scanned the bench. "I'm not asking for new law. I'm asking whether this chamber can still live by the words its own voices once believed. The pivot was over, and it had failed. Some lines aren't crafted for the chamber, they're carved for history. Kennedy had let them speak. Schiff with his legal pivots, the judge with their carefully modulated restraint, the gallery with its whispers that threatened to turn into headlines before the gavel could fall again. But through all of it, Kennedy hadn't fired the final round. Not yet. Now, with the folder shut, his hand rested on its cover as if sealing something heavier than paper. His eyes scanned the bench, then swept to the far corner where the cameras sat. Red lights glowing like a warning that every word here would live forever. He leaned forward. Not sharp, not loud, just precise. If believing in transparency makes me unpatriotic, then I suppose patriotism in this chamber is now defined by silence. The words landed not with a bang, but with a weight that pulled every head down for a second. The judge's fingers twitched against the gavel, Schiff's jaw set hard enough to show strain. The silence stretched until even the hum of the lights above seemed louder. And then, Kennedy added the line he had saved, not for Schiff, not even for the judge, but for the nation watching. But history doesn't remember the silence. It remembers who finally spoke. That was it. The room didn't breathe, the gavel didn't fall. Schiff didn't reply, because the line had traveled past them, past the walls, out into the cameras where it would replay again and again long after the chamber emptied. Kennedy sat back, hands folded. Nothing more to add, because the last line wasn't an argument, it was a verdict. Some words don't fade with the gavel, they replay in the silence that follows. The chamber had emptied halfway in spirit before the doors even opened. Schiff sat stiff, lips pressed into a line, as though daring the cameras not to zoom in. The judge scribbled something short, maybe just to move the pen because stillness was too loud. And Kennedy? He didn't look around for approval. He didn't wait for applause. He gathered his notes with the same calm he carried when he walked in. But before he rose, he gave one last glance at the bench, then toward the cameras. He spoke with the kind of quiet that doesn't need to echo, because everyone already knows it will. If silence is patriotism, then America's been betrayed by silence long enough. No one spoke. No one needed to. The weight wasn't in the chamber anymore. It was in the homes where televisions flickered, in the feeds where the clip would spread before nightfall, in the conversations that would begin before morning. That was the cold close, a line not shouted, not argued, not dressed in theatrics, just delivered once, and already unforgettable. If you've been with us through this confrontation, tell me, was Kennedy right to put it in those terms, or was Schiff justified in calling it unpatriotic? I want to hear your take in the comments.